When you hear words like BDSM or you see communities like furries, it's really easy for our minds to jump to all sorts of assumptions, right? A lot of stereotypes. But way beyond all that cultural noise, there are real human experiences that science is, honestly, just now starting to really understand. So today, we're going to push all those cliches to the side and look at the actual hard data.
So, what do we really know about the people in these communities? Are the stereotypes we all hear based in any kind of reality? Or are they just harmful myths? To figure that out, we've got to go straight to the science.
All right, let's dive in. We're going to be looking at a brand new study from King's College London. It's one of the first of its kind to take a really broad, numbers-driven look at 5 different, let's call them interest groups in the UK. This gives us a totally unprecedented peek into their psychology, who they are, and their behaviors.
Okay, before we go any further, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with a key term. The study uses the clinical phrase paraphilic interests. Now that might sound a little intense, but all it means, according to the American Psychiatric Association, is sexual interest between consenting adults that just happen to fall outside of what's considered typical. That's it. It's a neutral, scientific starting point, which is exactly what we need. So who are the 470 people who took part in this study? Well, the data shows a community that looks really, really different from the general population, and we see that right away when we look at sexual orientation. Okay, here's our baseline. This is what the UK as a whole looks like according to their Office of National Statistics. As you can see, the huge majority of the population, almost 95%, identifies as heterosexual. Just kind of keep these numbers in your head for a second because what you're about to see is a dramatic shift. And boom! What a contrast. In the study's BDSM sample, which was the largest group they looked at, less than 40% identified as straight. You see this huge jump in people identifying as bisexual, gay, and lesbian. And the researchers point out this isn't a fluke. This trend holds up across all 5 of the groups they studied. It really suggests these communities are incredibly diverse spaces.
And that diversity doesn't stop there. It also extends to how people approach relationships. In the general population, only about 2.4% of people are in a non-monogamous relationship. In this sample, that number leaps to over 14%. And what's also interesting is that they're way less likely to be single. So right from the get-go, it's super clear we're looking at a group with very different patterns.
All right, now we get to the really juicy part. This is where the study directly takes on some of the most common and, frankly, most damaging stereotypes out there. So let's put the myths up against the data. What did they find?
Okay, let's tackle a really persistent and harmful one. The idea that age play, where consenting adults role-play different ages, is somehow a substitute for an illegal interest in children. The data just flat out does not support this. The overwhelming majority of people in the study were actively repulsed by pedophilic fantasies. The two things are not the same.
And this chart just makes that distinction crystal clear. Look at the difference. When asked about fantasies involving consenting adult age play, you see high levels of arousal. But that response completely flips for illegal acts. When asked about sex with a child, nearly 73% of people found the idea very repulsive.
And we see pretty much the exact same pattern with another ugly stereotype, the idea that pet play or the furry community is just a cover for zoophilia. And again, the data says, nope. Participants were overwhelmingly repulsed by the idea of sex with actual, non-human animals. Almost 60% said the thought was very repulsive. The interest is about role play and anthropomorphism, not the animals themselves.
Finally, let's talk about that pop psychology idea you see in movies all the time, right? The idea that people who take on dominant roles in BDSM must be narcissistic or psychopathic. Well, the researchers actually measured for these so-called dark triad traits, and they found absolutely nothing. Zero. No significant personality differences between people who identified as dominant, submissive, or people who switch between roles. It's a role, not a personality disorder.
So beyond just busting a bunch of myths, the study also dug up something really fascinating about identity. It's about how people personally connect to these interests. And it turns out it's not some simple, straightforward spectrum.
So the researchers found something called a bimodal distribution when they asked a really important question. I know, that's a fancy-pants statistical term, but what it actually means is that people's answers all bunched up into 2 totally separate, opposite groups. And that has some huge implications for how we think about all this.
And this is exactly what bimodal looks like. It's wild, right? When they were asked, is this interest part of your sexual orientation? People didn't spread out evenly. Instead, you see these two giant bars at either end. Not at all and completely. Almost nobody was in the middle.
So what does that mean? It means that for people in these communities, their interest tends to be at one of two things. Either it's a deep, fundamental piece of their sexual identity, just like being gay or straight is, or it's just a fun hobby they enjoy. It's almost never something in between.
Okay, so after digging through all of this data, what's the big picture here? What does this research ultimately tell us about these communities that are so often misunderstood? So here's what we've learned. First, and this is the big one, the most harmful stereotypes are basically just myths, not supported by data. Second, these communities are way more diverse than the general population. Third, how someone relates to their interest is super personal. It's either a core part of who they are or it's a hobby. And finally, and this is really interesting, these groups are not living in separate bubbles at all.
In fact, a staggering 81% of the people surveyed said they had an interest in more than one of the 5 groups being studied. That paints a picture of a very interconnected landscape of interests and communities, not a bunch of separate walled-off silos.
And that really leads us to our final thought. This study took a bunch of stereotypes and replaced them with cold, hard data. And it revealed a reality that is so much more nuanced and diverse than the myths would have you believe. It kind of leaves you with a question, doesn't it? If the most common assumptions about these groups were so wrong, what other assumptions are we making? And what else is out there to discover about the huge, incredible spectrum of human sexuality?